Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I have a wild relationship story that will make you question everything. So let's start. I still remember the way the light hit the ring he gave me, reflecting off the window of that upscale bistro in downtown Chicago, while he promised me a life I thought only existed in movies. Looking back, it's almost impressive how well he played the part, because for 18 months, I wasn't just in love with a man named Julian Vance, I was in love with a ghost. A carefully constructed ghost who didn't actually exist. We met at a gallery opening in River North, and I'll admit, I was an easy target back then because I was 24, working a grueling entry-level marketing job, and living in a cramped studio that smelled like damp laundry and cheap takeout. Julian was 32, or so he said, with salt and pepper hair that gave him this distinguished, worldly energy that made me feel like I'd finally stepped into the big leagues. He told me he was a private equity consultant who traveled for work, which perfectly explained why he was often out of town from Tuesday to Thursday, and why he never seemed to have a traditional office I could visit. Our first few months were a whirlwind of high-end dinners, late-night walks along the lakefront, and the kind of effortless conversation that makes you feel like you've known someone for a lifetime. He was charming, attentive, and incredibly generous, always picking up the tab and surprising me with little gifts like vintage books or expensive candles. He told me he lived in a gated community in Lake Forest, an hour north of the city, but he claimed his house was undergoing a massive renovation after a pipe burst, so we always stayed at my place or at various boutique hotels he booked for the amenities. At the time, it felt like a romantic adventure, a series of staycations that kept our relationship feeling fresh and exciting, and I never once questioned why I couldn't just see the house, even if it was a construction zone. I was so caught up in the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the room, that I ignored the tiny flickers of inconsistency that started to pop up like weeds in a manicured garden. The first real crack happened about 6 months in, when I tried to tag him in a photo on Instagram and realized I couldn't find his profile. When I asked him about it over dinner, he laughed it off with a self-deprecating shrug, telling me that he deleted all his social media years ago because his job required a high level of discretion and he valued his privacy. It sounded logical enough, especially for someone in high finance, so I let it slide and just kept the photos for myself, tucked away in a private folder on my phone. Then there was the issue of his age, which came up during a casual conversation about childhood cartoons. He mentioned watching something that hadn't premiered until he would have been nearly 18, but when I pointed it out, he just chuckled and said he must have been thinking of a younger cousin he used to babysit. It was a small thing, a tiny slip of the tongue, but it was the first time I felt a cold shiver of doubt run down my spine, even if I buried it under layers of justification. As the year mark approached, Julian started talking about our future, mentioning that his renovation was almost finished and that he wanted me to move in with him by the summer. He even showed me photos of the progress on his phone. A stunning kitchen with marble countertops, a sprawling backyard with a pool, and a master suite that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I was ecstatic, already mentally packing my bags and imagining my life as a suburban wife in a beautiful home, far away from the noise and grime of the city. But every time I suggested driving up to see the progress in person, he had an excuse, saying the contractors were difficult or that the dust was so bad it wasn't safe for me to be there. I wanted to believe him so badly that I became his biggest defender, telling my skeptical friends that he was just a perfectionist who wanted everything to be just right before he officially brought me home. My best friend, Sarah, was the only one who didn't buy the private equity consultant story for a second, mostly because she worked in HR and had a sixth sense for when people were inflating their resumes. She kept pointing out that Julian never seemed to have any coworkers, never complained about a boss, and never had any LinkedIn presence whatsoever, which is unheard of in his supposed field. One night, after a few glasses of wine, she sat me down and told me that something felt off, that a man in his 30s with that much money should have a digital footprint or at least a few friends I'd actually met. I got defensive, accusing her of being cynical and jealous of my happiness, and we didn't speak for 2 weeks after that, which only isolated me further and made me cling tighter to the fantasy Julian was selling. I started ignoring the fact that he always paid in cash or with a specific corporate card that he never let me hold, and I stopped asking why his phone was always on silent and face down whenever we were together. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I was sent home early from work due to a massive power outage in our building. Julian was supposed to be in New York for a 3-day conference, so I didn't expect him to be around, but I decided to call him anyway just to hear his voice. It went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual, but something about the silence in my apartment made me feel restless and strangely paranoid. On a whim, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I took the train up to Lake Forest. I didn't have his exact address, but I remembered him mentioning a specific street name once during a long-winded story about his neighbors. I figured I'd just walk around, see the neighborhood, and maybe get a glimpse of the life that was waiting for me, like some kind of romanticized version of a private investigator. It took me nearly 2 hours to find the street he'd mentioned, a quiet, leafy cul-de-sac lined with massive, ivy-covered estates that looked exactly like the photos he'd shown me. I walked up and down the sidewalk, looking for any sign of a house under renovation, expecting to see scaffolding, dumpsters, or crews of workmen. But every single house was pristine, perfectly landscaped and quiet, with no sign of construction anywhere. I felt a pit of dread forming in my stomach, a cold, heavy weight that told me I was looking for something that didn't exist. I pulled out my phone and searched for the street name again, cross-referencing it with the photos Julian had sent me of his house. That's when I saw it, a real estate listing from 3 years ago for one of the houses on the block. The photos were identical to the ones Julian had shown me, right down to the specific pattern on the marble countertops and the view from the master bedroom window. The house had been sold years ago to a couple in their 60s, and it certainly wasn't owned by a 32-year-old consultant named Julian Vance. I sat down on a public bench at the end of the street, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone as the reality of the situation began to crash down on me. He'd lied about the house, he'd lied about the renovation, and if he'd lied about that, what else was a fabrication? I spent the train ride back to the city in a state of numb shock, staring out the window at the passing scenery, but seeing nothing but Julian's face and the way his eyes crinkled when he lied to me. I realized then that I didn't actually know his last name for sure. I'd seen Vance on a piece of mail once, but I'd never seen his ID, his passport, or anything official. I was a stranger to the man I thought I was going to marry, and the worst part was that I had let him walk me right into the trap. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't confront him immediately. I knew I needed more than just a fake house to break the spell he had over me. I needed to know who he really was, so I started digging through the few things he'd left at my place. A spare toothbrush, a pair of expensive Italian loafers, and a blazer he'd worn to dinner a few nights prior. I checked the pockets of the blazer, hoping for a receipt or a business card, and that's when I found a small, crumpled slip of paper from a local dry cleaner. It wasn't made out to Julian Vance. It was made out to a Mark Henderson, with a phone number that didn't match the one I had saved in my contacts. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed the number on the slip, my breath hitching in my throat as the line started to ring. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice sounding tired but kind. "Hello, Henderson residence?" I froze, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp as I realized I wasn't just dealing with a liar. I was likely dealing with a husband. I hung up without saying a word, my mind racing through every possible scenario, each one more devastating than the last. Was Mark Henderson Julian? Or was Julian just a name he used to escape his real life? I spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of internet sleuthing, using the name Mark Henderson and the general area of the dry cleaner to narrow things down. I found him on a local community board for a suburb much closer to the city than Lake Forest, a place called Elmhurst, and there he was in a photo from a neighborhood block party. He looked older, maybe late 30s, and he was standing next to a woman and a small child, a little girl who had his exact same lopsided smile. Seeing that photo felt like a physical blow to the chest, the kind that leaves you gasping for air while the world spins out of focus around you. The man in the picture was undeniably Julian, or Mark, I suppose, but he looked different, less polished, wearing a faded polo shirt and holding a plastic cup of beer while his arm was draped around the woman I'd heard on the phone. The caption identified them as Mark, Sarah, and their 4-year-old daughter, Lily, and just like that, the private equity consultant fantasy dissolved into the reality of a suburban dad living a double life. I spent that entire night scrolling through every public post I could find involving the Henderson family, piecing together a timeline that made me feel physically ill. While he was taking me to five-star restaurants and talking about our future in Lake Forest, he was going home to a modest three-bedroom house in Elmhurst, likely telling his wife he was working late or traveling for business. The level of calculated deception was staggering. He hadn't just lied about his name and his job. He'd invented an entire persona to cater to a 20-something girl's idea of a dream man. He wasn't 32. Mark Henderson was 39, and he didn't work in private equity. According to a local business directory, he was a mid-level insurance adjuster for a firm in the suburbs. Every detail of our relationship had been a performance, a way for him to step out of his mundane life and play the role of a wealthy, successful bachelor with no responsibilities. I felt a toxic mix of rage and humiliation, realizing that I was just a hobby for him, a temporary escape from a life he was clearly bored with. But as the anger settled into a cold, hard resolve, I realized I couldn't just walk away. I needed him to know that I knew, and I needed to see the look on his face when his carefully constructed world came crashing down. Julian, Mark, was supposed to come over on Friday night after his conference ended, and I spent the days leading up to it acting as normal as possible over text, though every "I miss you" I sent felt like it was coated in acid. I cleaned my apartment until it was spotless, set the table for a dinner I had no intention of eating, and waited for the sound of his key in the lock. When he finally walked through the door at 7 p.m., looking tired but flashing that same charming smile, I felt a wave of revulsion so strong I had to look away. He dropped his bag and came over to kiss me, but I stepped back, holding up the dry cleaner slip I'd found in his blazer. The transition on his face was fascinating to watch. The smile didn't just fade, it curdled, his eyes darting from the paper to my face as he tried to process how much I actually knew. "Who is Mark Henderson, Julian?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought he might be able to see it through my shirt. He tried to laugh it off at first, giving me some convoluted story about how Mark was a client whose blazer he'd borrowed after a spill, but the lie was thin and shaky, and we both knew it. I didn't let him finish. I just pulled up the photo of him at the block party on my phone and held it out so he couldn't avoid it. He went pale, the kind of gray-white color that makes a person look like they're about to faint, and he sank down onto my sofa without being asked. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of 18 months of lies. And for a moment, I actually felt a flicker of pity for him, seeing him slump there like a man who'd just lost everything. "How long have you been married?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. He didn't look at me when he answered, staring instead at the rug beneath his feet as he muttered, 10 years. 10 years of a life, a marriage, a child, and he'd managed to hide it all while making me feel like I was the center of his universe. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy, and started rambling about how his marriage was dead, how he and Sarah were just roommates, and how meeting me had made him feel alive for the first time in a decade. It was the classic cheater's script, a desperate attempt to frame his betrayal as a tragic love story where he was the victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own deceit. I listened to him for 20 minutes, let him pour out his confessions about how he hated his job and felt trapped by his responsibilities, but all I could think about was the woman in the photo and the little girl with his smile. I told him to leave, to get his things and never contact me again, but as he stood in the doorway, he had the audacity to ask if we could work through this once he figured things out with his family. I slammed the door in his face, locking it and leaning against the wood until I heard his footsteps fade away down the hall. I thought that would be the end of it, that I'd cry for a few weeks and eventually move on, but the anger wouldn't leave me. It felt like a physical presence in the room, demanding some kind of justice. A few days later, I found myself driving out to Elmhurst, not because I wanted to confront his wife. I wasn't that cruel, but because I needed to see the reality of his life with my own eyes. I parked a block away from his house, a modest but well-maintained colonial with a swing set in the backyard, and I watched from the car as Mark pulled into the driveway in a sensible SUV I'd never seen before. He got out of the car, and a moment later, the front door opened and the little girl, Lily, came running out to meet him, throwing her arms around his legs while he scooped her up and kissed her cheek. It was a scene of perfect, domestic bliss, the kind of thing you see in commercials, and it made the version of him I'd known feel even more like a hallucination. He looked happy, or at least content, and it infuriated me that he could step so seamlessly between two entirely different worlds without a hint of guilt. I stayed there for an hour, watching the lights come on in the house, imagining them sitting down to dinner while he told his wife about his long week at work. I realized then that he wasn't going to tell her. He was just going to go back to his life as if I had never existed, as if our 18 months together were just a dream he'd decided to wake up from. That's when I decided that if he wasn't going to be honest, I would be. I didn't want to destroy a family, but I also couldn't bear the thought of Sarah living a lie, being married to a man who was capable of such deep, sustained deception. I went home and spent the next several days compiling everything. The photos we'd taken, the texts he'd sent about our future in Lake Forest, and the receipts from the hotels he'd booked under his real name when he got careless. I put it all into a digital folder, a neat little package of betrayal that I intended to send to Sarah, but before I could hit send, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Mark, begging me to meet him one last time, saying he had something important to tell me that changed everything. I should have ignored it. I should have blocked him and moved on, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and I agreed to meet him at a park near his office the following afternoon. He looked terrible when I arrived, unkempt, with dark circles under his eyes, and he didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He told me that Sarah was pregnant with their second child, and that if I blew up his life, now, I wouldn't just be hurting him, I'd be ruining the lives of two innocent children. He tried to use his own family as a shield, weaponizing my empathy to ensure my silence, and for a moment, it actually worked. I felt a wave of guilt, wondering if I had the right to play God with someone else's marriage, especially with a new baby on the way. But then he said something that changed everything. "Look, I'll pay you, okay? Just tell me how much it takes for you to go away and forget you ever met me." The sheer coldness of that offer snapped something inside me. He thought I was just a problem to be settled, a transaction he could close with a check, and it made me realize that Mark Henderson didn't just lie about his age or his status. He lacked a fundamental human soul. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked away, ignoring his calls as he chased me to my car, shouting about how I was overreacting. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and I didn't go to my apartment. Instead, I drove back to Elmhurst, the digital folder already sent to Sarah's Facebook inbox with a brief, clinical note explaining exactly who I was and what had been happening for the last year and a half. I parked across the street from their house and waited, not because I wanted to see the fallout, but because I needed to be sure she saw it before he could get home and intercept her. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the suburban lawns, and I sat there in the silence of my car, feeling like a ghost watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. About 20 minutes after I'd sent the message, I saw the flicker of a television through the front window go dark, and then a figure appeared at the glass, Sarah. She stayed there for a long time, perfectly still, and I could only imagine her looking at her phone, scrolling through the months of evidence I provided. The selfies of us in bed, the texts where Julian called her a stifling burden he couldn't wait to leave, and the fake real estate listings for the Lake Forest house. The front door opened suddenly, and she stepped out onto the porch, looking small and fragile in the twilight, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach where the new baby was growing. She didn't scream or cry out. She just stood there, looking at the empty driveway, and for a second, our eyes met across the street. I don't know if she knew it was me, or if she just saw a stranger in a parked car, but the look of pure, hollowed-out devastation on her face is something that will haunt me until the day I die. I felt a surge of regret, so sharp it physically hurt, wondering if I had done the right thing or if I had just burned down a house to kill a spider. But then, Mark's SUV turned the corner, his headlights sweeping across the front of the house as he pulled into the driveway, blissfully unaware that the world he'd spent 10 years building had just evaporated. I watched him get out of the car, carrying a bag of takeout, and as he walked toward the porch, Sarah didn't move an inch to let him pass. The confrontation was silent from where I was sitting, a pantomime of gestures and shifting body language, but the energy was electric. Mark tried to reach out for her, likely starting some new lie or a desperate apology, but she recoiled as if his touch was toxic, her mouth moving in short, sharp bursts. He looked toward my car then, his face contorting in a mask of rage when he realized I was there. And for a moment, I was genuinely afraid he was going to come over and do something violent. But Sarah stepped between him and the street, her voice finally rising enough for me to hear a jagged, "Get out," echoing through the quiet neighborhood. He stood there for a long minute, the bag of food dangling from his hand like a pathetic peace offering, before he realized there was no talking his way out of this one. He got back in his car and sped away, the tires screeching against the asphalt, leaving his wife alone on the porch. I didn't stay to talk to her. There was nothing I could say that would make it better, and I was just as much a part of the wreckage as he was. I drove back to the city in a state of complete emotional exhaustion, the adrenaline finally leaving my system and leaving me feeling hollow and old. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was exactly as messy as you'd expect. Mark tried to sue me for emotional distress and harassment, a desperate legal move that his own lawyer eventually convinced him to drop when I threatened to take my story to the local news. Sarah filed for divorce almost immediately, and through the grapevine of social media and mutual acquaintances I'd uncovered during my research, I learned that he'd been fired from his insurance job after they discovered he'd been using company resources to fund our consultant lifestyle. The Julian Vance I'd loved was gone, replaced by a middle-aged man living in a cheap studio apartment on the edge of town, facing a mountain of debt and a family that wanted nothing to do with him. I thought I'd feel a sense of triumph or closure, but instead, I just felt a lingering sense of waste. 18 months of my youth, my trust, and my heart given to a man who didn't exist. I moved out of my apartment, found a new job in a different city, and tried to rebuild my life from the ground up, but the scars of that deception run deep. Even now, years later, I find myself scrutinizing the smallest details of people's lives, looking for the cracks, the inconsistencies, the hidden families tucked away in the suburbs. I heard recently that Sarah had her second child, a little boy, and that she's doing well, surrounded by a support system that Mark tried so hard to isolate her from. As for Mark, he's still around, occasionally popping up on dating apps under new names, still trying to sell the fantasy to some other girl who's looking for a way out of her mundane life. I sometimes think about sending them a warning, a heads up about the man with the salt and pepper hair and the charming smile, but I realize that you can't save someone who wants to believe the lie. We all want to believe in the fairy tale, in the man who swoops in and changes everything. And Mark Henderson's greatest crime wasn't the lying or the cheating. It was the way he turned my own hope into a weapon against me. The last time I saw him was purely by accident, a glimpse through the window of a coffee shop in a part of the city I rarely visit. He was sitting across from a woman who looked a lot like I used to, young, wide-eyed, and leaning in close to catch every word he said. He was wearing a nice suit, probably the same one he'd worn to our first dinner, and he was gesturing with his hands in that expansive, confident way that used to make me feel so safe. I considered walking in there, pulling up the photos on my phone, and ending it for her right then and there, but I stopped myself at the door. I realized that some lessons have to be learned the hard way, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always has a way of coming home. I turned around and walked away, leaving the ghost of Julian Vance behind me in the fluorescent light of the cafe, finally realizing that the only person who could truly set me free was myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached my car, a notification from a social media account I'd long since stopped checking. It was a message from an account with no profile picture, just 2 words that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Thank you." It was Sarah. We never spoke again after that night on the porch, and we likely never will, but in that one message, I felt a strange, bitter sense of solidarity. We were both survivors of a man who tried to rewrite reality, and while he was busy inventing new lives for himself, we were the ones left to do the actual work of living.